Everybody thinks they know the Nazi gold story. Buried treasure, hidden vaults, maybe a conspiracy or two. But the actual history isn't some adventure tale. It's a geopolitical catastrophe that stripped General George S. Patton of his authority, and quite possibly took his life. When Patton cracked open the Third Reich's financial backbone, he wasn't standing over a war trophy. He was staring at a diplomatic landmine that led straight back to Swiss banking houses and Allied governments alike. Patton pushed for full exposure. Washington demanded the opposite. What followed was a collision that erased billions from the record and ended with a death no honest investigator has ever fully explained. The whole thing began with pure chance. April 1945. Military police flagged a jittery Frenchwoman near the Merkers salt mine. She mentioned trucks rolling through the darkness under tarps. Hours later, Patton's soldiers were standing before a reinforced steel vault door buried 300 feet beneath the earth. Behind it, something cold, something metallic, something none of them had a name for yet. They blew the door, and what waited on the other side defied every expectation they carried down that shaft. 250 tons of gold bullion, every bar stamped with the Reich eagle, arranged in rows so meticulous, so deliberate, that this was clearly no desperate last-minute stash. Someone had engineered this over years, because that's exactly what had happened. Beyond the gold, 8,000 paintings looted from museums and private homes across occupied Europe. Rembrandts, Rubens, works ripped from the Louvre, from apartments in Warsaw, from family collections in Amsterdam. All taken, all catalogued, all hidden. Hundreds of millions in foreign currency representing every nation Germany had swallowed. Diamonds, jewels, entire numismatic collections of staggering rarity. And then, something that froze every man in his tracks. Hundreds of small pouches, each one labelled, each one sorted with bureaucratic care, each one packed with gold teeth and fillings extracted from the mouths of death camp prisoners. The entire financial engine of the Third Reich, buried while the country above it disintegrated into ash. Guarded by two aging soldiers who dropped their weapons the instant they saw American uniforms. Not a single round fired. Patton descended personally. He walked that mine for 2 straight hours. The officers beside him would later say they'd never witnessed anything like it. No bluster, no profanity, none of the explosive showmanship the world associated with his name. Just a man moving slowly between towers of stolen gold, pausing before a painting, picking up a document, barely speaking a word. When he surfaced, he issued 3 orders, immediately. And those 3 orders revealed precisely who Patton was when no journalist was scribbling notes and no camera was pointed at his face. First, a full armored perimeter around the mine. Nobody enters or exits without his personal clearance. Patton had lived around armies long enough to understand one absolute truth. Put soldiers next to treasure, and the outcome is never clean. Second, a complete inventory of everything underground. Every canvas, every gold bar, every sack of dental fillings, every scrap of currency, documented with obsessive precision, not as a logistical formality, as evidence. Evidence of atrocities that Patton was determined to preserve before the diplomats arrived and started negotiating things into silence, before the post-war dealmakers buried the uncomfortable parts along with the dead. Third, an urgent, direct communication to Eisenhower's headquarters. Come now, see this with your own eyes, because this changes the shape of everything. Eisenhower arrived 48 hours later, alongside General Omar Bradley. The 3 of them descended together in a narrow elevator that Patton later called genuinely terrifying in his diary. Consider the weight of that admission. A man who had absorbed gunfire, survived bombing runs, and stared down death a dozen times across 4 years of open warfare, a man who never once confessed to fear of anything, called a mine elevator terrifying. They reached the bottom. They walked through the vault. They saw the bullion, the stolen masterpieces, the neatly organized bags of teeth, pulled from murdered civilians. Eisenhower said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke. He wanted the entire world to witness this, every last piece of it, because he was already anticipating the deniers, the ones who would surface years later, insisting none of it was real. He wanted to eliminate every possible crack in the record. Patton agreed without hesitation. And here is something genuinely rare, a moment where Patton and Eisenhower stood on identical ground. Their relationship was famously strained, fractured by ego, by disagreement, by fundamentally different instincts about how wars should be fought and ended. But on this single point, no daylight separated them. Expose it all, force the world to look, make denial impossible. Patton had journalists and photographers hauled to that mine within days. He personally arranged for sitting members of the United States Congress to be flown in, walked them through the vault, made them look at the gold, the paintings, the bags of human teeth. Because Patton grasped something most generals never did. Wars aren't only decided on the ground, they're decided in the narrative that follows. And he was going to make damn sure this narrative got told, loudly, completely, by every witness he could assemble, before anyone had the chance to muffle it. Newsreel cameras captured the gold. Photos ran in papers across America. For roughly 2 weeks in April 1945, the Merkers mine became the most famous location on Earth. Patton was the man who'd cracked it open. Everything appeared clean and uncomplicated. Then Washington told him to pull back. Because here's the chapter of this story that almost nobody tells. The chapter that explains how a discovery this massive, this cinematic, this historically explosive, somehow vanished from public memory, quickly and almost totally. That gold didn't simply belong to Germany. An enormous share of it had been looted from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary, from Yugoslavia. Nations that were, at that precise moment, sliding under Soviet domination as the Red Army pushed west. The question of who gets the gold could not be separated from the question of who controls the countries it was taken from, and that was a conversation no one in Washington or London wanted happening out loud in April 1945. The alliance with Stalin still held, officially. The Pacific War was still raging. American strategists were running calculations suggesting they might need Soviet cooperation to invade Japan. Giving the gold back to Poland meant recognizing the Polish government in exile in London. That meant an open collision with Stalin, who already had his own hand-picked Polish government waiting to be installed in Warsaw the moment hostilities ended. Nobody in Washington would pick that fight over bullion, not with larger confrontations still ahead. But that was only half the problem. Some of that gold hadn't traveled straight from European treasuries into the Merkers mine. It had passed through Switzerland first. The Swiss National Bank had accepted Nazi gold throughout the war, no questions asked. And portions of that gold had subsequently flowed into accounts tied to American and British financial institutions. Firms that had maintained business relationships with Germany before the war, and in certain cases, quietly, during it. A full public audit of every bar in that mine, each one traced to its origin, would have tugged on threads leading to places that extremely powerful, extremely respectable people on both sides of the Atlantic had every reason to keep buried. This wasn't a conspiracy in any dramatic sense. It was something more ordinary, and in some ways far more unsettling. The people making decisions about the Merkers gold had personal and institutional stakes in ensuring that certain questions never got asked too loudly or answered too thoroughly. Patton had zero interest in any of it. He genuinely, thoroughly, almost violently did not care about diplomatic sensitivity or political entanglements or the financial anxieties of well-connected men who'd made ugly choices before the war. He cared about the soldiers who bled taking Germany. He cared about the people the Nazis had murdered. He cared about making certain that stolen property went back to the people it was stolen from. He said so, loudly, repeatedly, with the kind of raw bluntness that made him devastating on a battlefield and nearly unmanageable everywhere else. He demanded faster restitution. He demanded greater transparency. He demanded a complete public accounting of everything inside that mine and everything that happened to it afterward. He made enemies in Washington. He made enemies at the State Department. He made enemies among the Allied administrators tasked with managing Germany's post-war transition, men who found Patton's insistence on doing the right thing, publicly and noisily, to be, as one memo phrased it, operationally inconvenient. In September 1945, 5 months after the Merkers discovery, Patton was stripped of command of the Third Army. The official justification was a press conference. Patton compared Nazi Party members to Republicans and Democrats. He argued that former Nazis ought to be permitted to help run post-war Germany. They were the only ones who knew how administration worked. It was a reckless thing to say. Patton understood that the instant the words left his mouth. But the men who wanted him gone had been hunting for a pretext for months. He handed them one on a silver platter. They reassigned him to a hollow administrative role. No troops, no authority. His new task was writing a war history that no one had requested and no one would read. He was 59 years old, the most effective battlefield commander America had ever produced, and they had placed him on a shelf to collect dust. 3 months later, December 9th, 1945, Patton sat in the back of a staff car on a road outside Mannheim. A U.S. Army truck executed a sudden left turn and struck his vehicle. The impact was low speed. No one else in either vehicle suffered serious injury, but Patton's neck snapped. 12 days later, he was dead. The sole fatality of a collision that by every measurable standard should not have killed anyone. The details of that crash have drawn suspicion ever since. The truck's driver, Robert Thompson, offered shifting and contradictory explanations for why he turned when he did. A key witness, Frank Kupiecki, later alleged that the accident scene had been tampered with before investigators reached it. In 2008, Douglas Bazata, a former OSS officer, declared publicly that he had been contracted to assassinate Patton, that the car wreck had been staged. His claims have never been conclusively verified. Historians remain split on their credibility. What nobody disputes is this: Patton had been accumulating powerful enemies for months. He had been loud about his plans to return home and launch a political career. He had been openly hostile toward the architects of the post-war settlement. And his death arrived at precisely the moment when the people most irritated by his existence had the strongest possible motive to see him silenced. Of the 250 tons of gold recovered at Merkers, a meaningful share was eventually restored to the nations from which it had been looted. That process consumed decades. It was never truly finished. The artwork was largely recovered and returned, though certain pieces remain missing to this day, surfacing occasionally at auction houses under circumstances that provoke deeply uncomfortable questions. But the gold itself, the bars, the coins, the dental fillings, was never fully accounted for. Researchers and investigators working from declassified files released in the 1990s estimated that somewhere between 10 and 20% of the total value of the Merkers Hall simply vanished in the months following the war's end. Some was pilfered by individual soldiers amid the chaos of the final weeks of combat. Some was seized by former Nazi officials who used it to bankroll their escapes to Argentina, Brazil, and Spain through the rat lines organized with help from the Vatican and certain American intelligence operatives. And some of it, according to those same declassified records, was quietly funneled into post-war reconstruction accounts and intelligence budgets overseen by men who had every reason to ensure no one ever examined too closely where the funding originated. Patton discovered that gold. He fought to make the world aware of it. He demanded transparency and accountability at a moment when the men holding power wanted neither. He was stripped of command, sidelined, then killed in a wreck that has never been adequately explained, in a country he had helped liberate 3 months before he intended to go home. The gold he uncovered remains unaccounted for 8 decades later, and the full story of what happened to it, and to him, has never been told.